So what you're looking at is basically kind of a mechanistic way of thinking about the heart. Almost, it's a couple of pumps with pipes attached to the pumps. And in a way, that's not a bad way to think about the heart. In fact, we're going to kind of move through this diagram, and I realize it might look a little bit foreign to you right now, but I think once I start labeling these things, you'll start to see that it's not so bad. So let's get started in the upper part of the heart. Right atrium, it's right there. The right ventricle goes there, so the blood goes down into the right ventricle. And then on the other side, I'm going to label the last two chambers. So, of course, that's the left atrium and that's the left ventricle. So we're going to actually follow the path of blood after it leaves the right ventricle. So we're going to start our journey here at the right ventricle. So what's the first thing that kind of comes across? Well, our blood leaves the right ventricle, goes through a valve, and after, on the other side, you've got this area right here. And I've drawn it as one tube, you'll see, with no split. And this is the pulmonary trunk. So blood is headed towards the lungs, going first through the trunk, and of course, after the trunk, there's a left and right. So pulmonary arteries are next. And remember, I call them arteries because they're going away from the heart. And there are two arteries, so pulmonary arteries left and right pulmonary arteries. And that's why you see two things here. So you see one here and you see one here. And those are basically tubes. So it's going from the pulmonary trunk and it's splitting into one of the two tubes. And I'm drawing the left and right lung up top, as you can go ahead and see that. And of course you know that the lungs are actually not going to look this way, so this is not anatomically correct, but this is not, as I said in the beginning, a bad way of thinking about it. So blood goes through the lungs and then comes out on the other side, and there we're going to talk about left and right pulmonary veins. So once again, both sides. And actually, here I'm going to make the point that there aren't just two pulmonary veins, one for each lung. Actually, there's usually more than that. And so when I draw these two, I really want you to just think of the two sides, veins coming from both sides. But the actual number could be a few pulmonary veins in total. So the pulmonary veins drain blood and into the left atrium, right? So now we're on the other side of the heart. So this has kind of been the first part of our journey. And this part of the journey is called the pulmonary circulation. So the fact that this part, starting from the heart and going back to the heart, is one circuit. And our heart actually has two circuits, but I want to point out these circuits one at a time. So we've already kind of completed one circuit. So I'm going to just take some blue color here, and you can kind of see it, that turquoise-ish color, to indicate the deoxygenated blood, or blood without oxygen. So I'm going to paint in how it looks, and you can see that. So you can kind of see now deoxygenated blood kind of goes from the right ventricle, through the pulmonary trunk, through the arteries, and into the left and right lung. And then you can kind of see there in the middle that it kind of changes to a darker color. And that's to indicate there that once it gets to the lung, it's going to kind of be mixed in with the capillaries, and it's going to start getting oxygen. And then it's going to come out on the other side in the pulmonary veins. So the pulmonary veins are going to deliver that oxygenated blood to the left atrium. So you can kind of see that it started as a turquoise color. That was the deoxygenated blood. Then the purplish violet color in the middle there, that's where it starts mixing with the capillaries. It's starting to receive oxygen. And then there, your pink going through the veins there and into the left atrium, that shows that it's oxygenated. So what you see kind of colored in now is the pulmonary circulation. So that's the first part of our circuit. Let's now keep going and talk about the second part of the circulatory system, which is the systemic circulation. So now the journey starts with the left ventricle. Let me start there. For the systemic circulation, I'm going to start in the left ventricle, and it's going to go around to the body, right? So you can see that down there. So the body is kind of the thing that's going to be receiving all of the blood. And when I say body, I really mean a lot of things. I mean things like the brain. So it could be an organ like the brain or the liver. It can also be things like bones. All these different organs and tissues are going to be getting blood from the left ventricle. It's going to be going initially through a giant vessel. This vessel is the aorta. So this large vessel right here, the aorta. And of course, it branches and splits, and I haven't shown all branches that come off the aorta, but there are many of them. So it goes to the various tissues and organs, and then it comes back on the other side. And then at the end, kind of somewhere up there, it's going to go back to the right atrium. And it generally travels through two major kinds of vessels. So one is the inferior and the other is the superior, meaning lower and upper. And they both are called vena cava. So superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. So these are the two major veins that bring you back blood from all the different parts of the body. So now you've actually seen the second circulation because it all ends up in the right atrium. And this is the systemic circulation. So now you can see that the heart is really two different circuits. And the first one, the pulmonary circulation, is really kind of relying on the right ventricle as the pump. And the second one is relying on the left ventricle as the pump. And here's a picture of systemic circulation colored in. It would kind of deliver all the blood to the various organs, and the organs would use the oxygen. So then you can see it went back to blue. That's to indicate deoxygenated blood, and it goes back to the right atrium as deoxygenated. So this is kind of how we sometimes see it. And again, this doesn't show you or give you an appreciation for the anatomy exactly, like where things branch off and where the different names make sense, but you got kind of an overall feel for the fact that we have two different circulations, and you can see where the blood is going for the two different circuits. So when we looked at that diagram, you could say, well, okay, I guess I can see all the different tissues are getting the blood. Basically sounds like everything is coming from the oxygenated blood coming out of the left ventricle. But some tissues always kind of trick people. So I'm just going to kind of try to target a couple of the tissues that I think people sometimes might have questions about. And one of them, I wouldn't really call it tissue, but you can definitely call it a cell type. So it's the RBC, which just stands for red blood cell. So people sometimes wonder, if the red blood cells are carrying oxygen to other parts of the body, then how do they themselves get oxygen? They just kind of use up some of the oxygen they're carrying, or what exactly? And to answer this question, I would have to remind you that the red blood cell basically looks a little bit like this. Right? And it doesn't have any mitochondria. No mitochondria. And remember, mitochondria are these tiny little organelles inside of cells that are using oxygen. So that has no mitochondria, and it's not really using oxygen. So it's not using oxygen. And really, these cells, we call them cells, and they are in many senses of the word, but they don't really have mitochondria. They also don't have a nucleus. So they're basically, literally, amazingly designed cells that are made for the purpose of carrying around oxygen. So just remember, red blood cells don't really need oxygen. They're simply carrying it around. So another tissue or organ that makes people kind of wonder is the heart. And the heart is pumping all the blood around, but does it actually get oxygen from vessels that are in the pulmonary circulation or the systemic circulation, or what? And here, the short answer is systemic circulation. That's kind of the quick answer. And let me actually show you where the blood vessels come from. These are called coronary vessels. So these coronary vessels, they actually come right off the aorta here and here. So they kind of come off the aorta right away. They are the first branches off the aorta, actually. So the first branches go off and serve the heart. So it's kind of the first to get systemic circulation blood. And the veins, actually, they drain into a spot directly into the right atrium. There's actually a little spot right there and that they drain into. And finally, kind of a tricky one, the lungs. And this is, I said tricky, and I kind of say this for last because there are actually blood vessels. And again, don't worry so much about the anatomy, but it's coming off of the systemic circulation. And you've got a vessel going to the right lung, and then you also have another vessel going to the left lung. So you've got a couple of arteries that are branching off, and these are also part of the systemic circulation. And these are called bronchial arteries. And these bronchial arteries bring then oxygenated blood. And you might say, well, that wasn't so difficult, but I'll say bronchial vessels because there are also some veins coming off. Actually, you know what? Let me draw the veins for you so you can kind of see how those end up. And these veins actually come from the right lung, and they end up dumping here. So you've got another vein from the other lung that ends up going about there. And so they don't necessarily dump directly into the inferior superior vena cava. I just want to show that they're going to the venous side on the systemic circulation. So if that was it, it would still be really simple, but actually lungs are kind of interesting in the sense that there is a lot of mixing going on. So you've got pulmonary arteries carrying blood, you've got bronchial arteries carrying blood, and that blood mixes. And then you've got the capillaries. You've got some blood kind of from both places. The pulmonary circulation and the blood from the systemic circulation, again, mixing. And then on the other side, where the veins are bringing blood back to the heart, most of the blood, as it turns out, most of the blood actually goes this way. And it goes into the pulmonary veins. So even though you have the bronchial arteries bringing blood back in, you know the bronchial arteries bringing blood back in, a lot of that blood ends up going this way. So that's kind of an interesting fact that not as much goes this way directly into that systemic circulation. So that's kind of the tricky thing to keep in mind. But the lungs then technically really are getting blood both from the systemic circulation, but also they are kind of mixing blood, and they're mixing blood with the pulmonary circulation. This concludes Unit 1, Lecture 3.